One music theory technique that every composer should have in their inventory is the secondary dominant chord. I've mentioned these on the channel before, and you might already know the concept, but let's review in case you don't. A secondary dominant chord is a type of chord that can make a chord progression feel more powerful. So first, in any key, the 5 chord, or the chord built off of the 5th note of the scale, is called the dominant chord. Dominant chords have a major third and a flat 7th, and the tension of these two notes together make this chord want to move somewhere else. Specifically, the 5 chord wants to move to our home chord, the 1 chord of whatever key we're in. So in the key of F major, a C7 chord will want to move to an F chord. This is called a resolution because we took the tension from the C7 chord and resolved it, without even needing to call in a mediator from HR. Now, if you're in the key of F and you're using other chords from inside the key, like say G minor and B flat, you can take any of those other chords and pretend for a second that you're in that chord's key. So if we move from F to G minor, then we can zoom in on G minor and pretend that we're in the key of G minor for a sec. What would the 5 chord in the key of G minor be? It would be a D7, and D7 wants to resolve to G minor. So we can put in a D7 chord and let it do just that. But if we zoom out, now we see that we've gone from F to D7, which is not usually found in the key of F. Using notes from outside of the key, like this F sharp note here, can sometimes be tricky to get right, but using secondary dominant chords to bring in out-of-key notes ensures that these notes sound good and resolve well, creating motion and color without ever sounding wrong or weird or bad or unintentional. These chords are often labeled in classical circles as the 5 of 2 or the 5 of whatever chord they're resolving to. And in jazz circles, they're more often thought of as whatever scale degree they're built off of, like a dominant 3 chord as opposed to a regular minor 3 chord. Both naming conventions have benefits, and I think everyone should be able to think of them in both ways, so I'll be using both terms interchangeably throughout the video. Okay, so now, different secondary dominant chords from within a key will have different effects from each other. In our example, we approached the 2 chord of the key, which had a certain feeling to it, but if we used a secondary dominant to the 6 chord, say, it would evoke a different kind of flavor. If we take all of the chords in a key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we can approach each of them with their own personal secondary dominant chord and see the precise effect each one has on the music. Let's take out the 1 chord, because 5 to 1 is not a secondary dominant, that's just a dominant, like we covered. We'll also take out the 7, because nobody ever resolves a secondary dominant to a diminished 7 chord. That just doesn't really work. That leaves us with 5 options for secondary dominants to introduce into your key to give it some life and motion. Let's go through them each, using video game music for our examples, of course. First off, we have our 2 chord. The 2 chord is used more often than not as the bump in the bump set spike formation that is the 2-5-1 progression. Bringing in the secondary dominant to the 2 chord is often a way to extend this setup, to create more motion leading up to the 5 chord set in order to make the spike to the 1 chord feel more satisfying. There's no clearer example than the theme from Yoshi's Island, which starts on our 1 chord, F, then moves to a secondary dominant D7 chord with the melody walking down a D7 arpeggio to really spell it out. This resolves to a G minor, the 2 chord, which springs up to the 5 chord, C7, which sets up a resolution back to F to start the next phrase. You can feel how functional this move is. The D7 chord sounds intriguingly out of key, but still feels natural as part of the larger engine chugging along to get us back to the 1 chord. The 1 dominant 6, 2, 5 progression can be a great light-hearted loop. The dominant 6 chord can also be used as a way to end a phrase with a surprise, a sudden twist to catch your listener off guard in a way that still sounds totally pleasant. The 7 a.m. theme from the original Animal Crossing is in the key of E flat major and sets up a steady upward chord progression moving from E flat to F minor to G minor. Rather than go back down to F minor, which is common, or keep moving up to A flat, the phrase ends with a leap down to the 5 of 2 C7 chord. and the sudden introduction of an out-of-key note for the first time in the piece is a real ear-catching moment. The C7 quickly drops us back at an F minor chord to start the following phrase, keeping the vibe appropriately relaxed even with this moment of surprise. The ability to surprise a listener is a hugely important skill for a composer to have, and doing so without damaging the lighthearted atmosphere of the piece is brilliant. Freezy Flake Galaxy's theme from Super Mario Galaxy 2 does basically the exact same move, in the key of A this time, walking up from A to B minor to C sharp minor before ending the phrase with a sudden turn to an F sharp 7 chord that brings us back to B minor. This time, the melody reaches up to grab the flat 9th of that F sharp 7 chord, a very common extension to add to a dominant 6 chord. So far, all of these examples have felt lighthearted, but the 2 chord can also sound a little gloomy when it wants to. The trick is phrasing. In each of these previous examples, the 2 chord was placed in a prime spot to set up a 2-5-1 progression. But if we take a little more time on both the 2 chord and its secondary dominant before it, we can bring out the chord's murkier qualities. Starlight Zone's theme from the first Sonic the Hedgehog starts with a C major opening chord and moves to an extended stay on a D minor chord, set up with a B flat to A7 secondary dominant maneuver. The added B flat leading into the A7 extends the out-of-key borrowing from D minor, and the embellished descending root to 7th to flat 7th to 6th line over that D minor chord really puts us in the key of D minor for a bit, rather than just using it as a pit stop on the way to where we're going. The extra emphasis does feel darker, but the D minor chord still fulfills its typical function by leading us into the following G chord to get back home. The 5 of 2, or dominant 6 chord, is a very common and very useful chord, much more common and useful than our next example. The secondary dominant leading to the 3 chord is a tough one to find in the wild for some reason. The 3 chord by itself is a relatively rare choice. It's a very dark sound within a major key, and adding a secondary dominant to it accentuates that quality. The only example I've found in video game music is from Final Fantasy VI's aria di mezzo carattere, but luckily it's a very clear example. The piece plays with the relationship between the 1 and 3 chords throughout the song, starting with a clear melody outlining the tonic D major triad, and then moving to a variation of the phrase outlining an F sharp minor triad. This G sharp melody note is such a subtle detail, but it's so key to the point of the piece, accentuating this contrast between the tranquil D major and the devastating F sharp minor. Anyways, the end of the phrase sees our tonic D major stepping down to a C sharp 7 chord, a secondary dominant with an added sus 4 to 3 windup, supercharging the resolution to the F sharp minor chord that follows. That A chord comes in pretty quick after, but if we had more time to sit on that F sharp minor, I think the darkness of the sound would be more apparent. Now let's move on to my favorite secondary dominant. The dominant 1 chord, or the 5 of 4, is a move that just never misses. You're chugging along through your chord progression, setting up some tension that wants to resolve, and then you give the listener a nice resolution to the 1 chord. Oh wait! This 1 chord isn't resolved at all! It's gearing up to send you flying straight to the prettiest chord in the key. The 4 chord is one of the big 3 and obviously shows up a lot no matter what kind of music you're listening to, so there are plenty of opportunities to throw this secondary dominant in there. The new Super Mario Bros. Theme showcases the most straightforward example of this I could ever have hoped of finding. A lot of Mario tracks use this move as part of a longer, windier setup to get back home to the 1 chord, like in Super Mario 64's Bob-omb Battlefield. Moving from a normal 1 chord to a 1/7 chord to a 4 chord to whatever the 4 chord wants to lead to can be a really exciting progression. We see the key voice leading of this type of movement laid out super clearly in the bassline of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time theme, which goes from B flat to B flat over A flat to E flat over G in the key of B flat major. Sometimes it can be hard to write music that sounds major without coming across as dumb, but this type of move sounds very optimistic without sounding overly simplistic. My favorite uses of this chord, though, are the ones that really milk it, that let you sit on that dominant 1 chord until you just can't take it anymore. Animal Crossing New Horizons' Shop Closing theme, a track I've devoted a whole video to already, starts on our home C chord, moves to a pretty C major 7 chord, and then lets that 7th drop down another half step to stew on a C7 chord for 2 whole bars at a slow tempo, before finally pushing us to the following F chord. Gorgeous. A deep cut that I absolutely adore is Odigan Town from 1996's Shining Wisdom, which takes the opposite approach to Shop Closing by having its tonic C chord's 5th move up a half step at a time to get to the 7th. Moving from C to C augmented to C6 to C7, and then sitting on the C7 for a full 2 bars before catapulting us to the 4 chord. By the time we get to that 4 chord, it feels so satisfying. And really, isn't that exactly what secondary dominants are for? The 5 of 5 chord isn't particularly hip. It's mostly used as a way to evoke either old school ragtime jazz or even older school classical music, but it is responsible for the most iconic video game intro of all time. The dominant 2 chord always feels a little theatrical to me, like it's throwing open the curtains and saying, "Ta-da! Here's the 5 chord!" If the regular 2-5-1 is a bump, set, spike, then using the 5 of 5 is like your opponent spiking the ball towards you, but you catching it and passing it up and spiking it down against them. If that makes sense. I've been watching a lot of Haikyuu lately. A clear example can be seen in the main theme to Super Mario Bros. 2, which follows an upbeat 1 to dominant 2 to 5 to 1 progression. This is definitely going for the old school ragtime jazz vibe, a sound which we hear even more authentically accessed via the same progression in Cuphead's Inkwell Isle. You don't have to get cute with it if this is the vibe you want. This progression is a very straightforward way to get there. On the classical side of the spectrum, we get basically the same curtain-pulling effect, but with a little more poise. The epilogue music from A Link to the Past moves from the 4 chord of the key, F, to a D7 over F sharp to a G7 chord, giving us a nice chromatic F to F sharp to G walk-up in the bass. This secondary dominant gives the 5 chord a little more weight, doesn't it? The Symphony of the Night's wood carving partita is in a minor key, but the 5 of 5 chord is used to the same effect to set up this weighty and dignified 5 chord in the key of C minor. Classical music is all about the 5 chord, so anything that puts more of a spotlight on the 5 chord can be used to great effect in classical contexts. Our final example is a little less theatrical though. The 6 chord is the relative minor of the tonic and shares a special Cain and Abel relationship with the 1 chord. Using the secondary 5 of 6 can effortlessly make a chord progression take a darker turn. Now, I know I've already used Super Mario Bros. 2's title theme, but it's full of great examples. It just sits on secondary dominant chords for such a long time. You have enough time to hear exactly how the dominant 3 chord sounds in the theme's bridge, which jumps straight to an E7 in the key of C and then resolves to a downcast A minor chord. The dominant 2-5 that follows brings us out of our depressive episode and right back to upbeat Goomba stomping goodness. Brazil's theme from Civilization 6, which is an arrangement of Ernesto Nazareth's Briero, spends a lot of time grooving in an unequivocally positive atmosphere. We're just trading between G and D7, getting a lot of time to enjoy our major key, which makes it feel like such a twist when we all of a sudden throw in a B7 chord, the 5 of 6, which promptly resolves to the 6 chord, E minor, and kicks off a winding progression to get back home to G. This secondary dominant creates a sense of distance between the 1 chord and the 6 chord. The 6 chord can sometimes feel like an extension of the 1 chord in a progression, but throwing a dominant 3 chord in between them makes the 6 chord feel like we're a long way from home. Using the dominant 2 chord afterwards, by contrast, crosses this distance by creating a bunch of momentum to send us sailing right back where we came from. Dragon Quest's theme shows us this exact same progression. After setting up our theme in F major, we take a detour out to the 6 chord by way of an A7 to D minor resolution. This moves smoothly into another secondary dominant 2 chord, which carries us back into our original key with the final 5 chord C7. Adding secondary dominance in front of every chord in a progression gives each chord so much extra weight. It's like a high-definition version of the classic 1-6-2-5 progression. Secondary dominants are about as fundamental of a technique as it gets. They can be so effective in so many different genres of music, from pompous classical themes to ragtime jazz to funky grooves and everything in between. They're all used about the same way, but each one has a different personality and evokes a slightly different atmosphere. So it's worth taking the time to explore each kind of secondary dominant, if you feel so inclined. If you're trying to figure out how to break out of strictly inside the key writing, I would highly recommend secondary dominance as the place to start. Thanks so much for watching. Check out my Patreon if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next one.